Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeff Mitchell. I work here at Rhodes Scholar, and it's my pleasure today to host this virtual lecture, A House Divided, Housing Segregation and Gentrification in Detroit. Today, you'll be hearing from Jamon Jordan. Jamon is a historian and educator based in Detroit, Michigan, and is the founder of Black Scroll Network History and Tour Company. So, without further ado, let's all have a warm virtual welcome for today's presenter, Jamon Jordan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad that you guys are here to hear a little bit about Detroit's history, particularly its history around housing segregation and gentrification. Again, my name is Jamon Jordan. I'm a historian and tour leader right here in the city of Detroit. So the name of this presentation is A House Divided, but I'm going to pay specific attention to one particular case, and that is the Dr. Ocean and his wife Gladys Sweet case. So although I'm going to be talking about housing segregation in general, there's going to be a little bit more attention paid to this one case in the 1920s with the Sweets, Dr. Ocean and his wife Gladys Sweet in 1925. So let's start. So the first thing I want to start with are some terms, and these are some terms we ought to know. And so the first term is restrictive covenants or racial restrictive covenants. So this will come up in the presentation. And what a restrictive covenant or a racial restrictive covenant is, it's an agreement between the property owner who may be trying to sell that property and a prospective property buyer. And what that agreement says is that it restricts who can buy, who can sell, who can lease, or who can occupy a space, or who can rent also that space. And so when the owner is selling it to a new prospective owner, they force that new prospective owner to sign this document as well. And a racial restrictive covenant will say you cannot rent, sell, or lease to a Negro or colored, or whatever term they were using for African Americans. And so historically, these were included in the deed itself or attached to the deed as a rider. And so we'll be talking about restrictive covenants. Redlining is another term that comes from housing discrimination. And it's a practice that prevents or restricts banks, insurance companies, or other corporations from doing certain types of business or offering certain benefits in certain geographical regions. Historically, these policies were aimed at African Americans, and they were normalized by federal housing policy. So we'll be talking about redlining. Basically, where African Americans live, banks couldn't do certain things for them that they could do in other communities. Blockbusting is another term. It is the practice of using false data to motivate whites to move away from a neighborhood and hoping that they'll sell their property at a loss, while at the same time motivating African Americans to move into that neighborhood, usually at a marked up rate. One way that blockbusting was done is the real estate company or agent would hire an African American to go down the street with a baby carriage, as if they're moving into the neighborhood. And then the real estate agents would call the owners in the neighborhood and let them know, hey, you know, you got those people, or they're coming into your neighborhood. You might want to sell now before it's too late and your property value goes down. And so whites would sell and move away, and African Americans would, the same real estate agents would be prompting African Americans to move in that neighborhood and heighten the prices of the properties that the African Americans are moving in. So this is blockbusting. Steering is an historic practice of real estate agents to only show whites homes in all white neighborhoods or predominantly white neighborhoods, while only showing African Americans homes in predominantly black or all black neighborhoods. And so African Americans would never see all the homes that they could possibly afford, and whites would never see all the homes that they could afford. It was a way to keep segregation and almost keep it invisible, where the buyers didn't even really realize that they were being segregated. Gentrification is the residential transformation of a community due to the moving in of higher income residents or businesses, which brings the property value and the property taxes up. But in many cases, it forces the low income renters and homeowners who live there, they're forced to move away. And then of course, we're gonna be talking about urban renewal, which comes from government policies on the city, state, and federal level, and how they targeted African American communities. All right, so now that we got those terms out the way, I'm going to move into the presentation. So we're going to be talking about Dr. Sweet, but what you need to know is that 2 years ago, the Sweet home, which is behind these 5 gentlemen standing here at this press conference a couple of years ago, the Sweet home, Dr. Ocean and Gladys Sweet home, received a $500,000 grant from the National Park Service back in 2018 as a civil rights site. So they're turning the home into a historic center, almost like a museum, where people will be able to go inside of the home, learn the history of the Sweet case and other history in the city of Detroit and around housing and civil rights. And they'll be able to enter it and visit it as a civil rights and historic site. And so that grant was issued a couple of years ago, and the home has been going through a massive refurbishment in those last, up until the coronavirus happened. So there was a stop on the work being done on the home. So I don't know when they're going to restart it. It was scheduled to open this September as a museum. So I'm not sure if they're going to keep with that schedule because everything changed once the pandemic hit. The owner of the home is the one at the podium right there. His name is Daniel Baxter. He grew up in that home and he is the present day owner. Once the grant is finished and the home is refurbished, there will probably be some kind of partnership between him and the National Park Service. I'm not sure how it's going to all shake out, but I don't think he'll be the sole owner of the home anymore. So now we're going to talk about Dr. Sweet and the case. So before we can get to the 1925 case, we got to know a little bit of background about Dr. Sweet. And so in 1901, Fred Rochelle, a 16-year-old Black teenager, was lynched by a mob in Bartow, Florida. And the reason he's lynched, he's killed by a mob, is that a white woman had allegedly been raped and murdered, and Rochelle was blamed as the culprit. Invitations went out to see what they called the barbecue. He was chained and covered in kerosene. He was burned alive for 15 minutes. One of the witnesses to this lynching was a young Dr. Ocean Sweet. He wasn't a doctor yet, of course, but he was a young, he was about 9 years old, and he saw this. At the age of 13, Dr. Sweet, or Ocean Sweet, leaves Florida to attend Wilberforce College in Ohio. Wilberforce is the first African-American owned and operated college in the United States. It was founded in 1856 by a coalition of abolitionist white Methodists and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, known as the AME Church. So there were Black Methodists and white Methodists. The white Methodists were abolitionists. They worked with these Black Methodists, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, to found a school. And it is the first African-American owned and operated college because since 1863, the AME Church has owned and run this school, and it's still in operation today. Its earliest students were children of white slave owners. So of course, some of the slave owners had Black children from the women who were being enslaved on the plantation. And so it would be those children were the first students at Wilberforce. From 13 to 17, Ocean Sweet attended prep school at Wilberforce. He shoveled snow, he washed dishes, he waited tables, he chopped firewood, he worked as a bellhop to pay for his books and tuition to attend this college for his 4 years of undergraduate education. While there, he was one of the founding members of the Delta chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi, which is an African-American Greek-lettered fraternity. And after receiving his Bachelor's of Science degree, he went to Howard University Medical School. While attending Howard University, there were 20 race riots throughout the country in 1919. That's known as the Red Summer. So the Red Summer of 1919 was a nationwide continuous race riots throughout the country. And African-American communities were targeted in these race riots. One of these outbreaks of violence occurred in Washington, D.C. The 1919 race riots were connected to the Great Migration. And the Great Migration is when African-Americans were leaving the Deep South to find a better life in the North, the Midwest, and the West. And as more African-Americans were coming to these communities that were, before these African-Americans were there, they were predominantly or all white. Many whites were not open to these African Americans coming to these communities and competing for jobs and living in close proximity. Also, what's happening at the same time, whites are leaving the South and coming to the North and the West and the Midwest, and they're bringing their Southern ideas of racial norms with them. And of course, lastly, after World War I, there were less jobs, and there was large-scale animosity towards Black people who many whites felt were taking their jobs away. So in DC, there was a rumor that a white woman had been attacked, and white mobs went into the African-American neighborhood and attacked random Black people. Black people were being pulled off streetcars and beaten. They began to arm themselves and defend themselves against the attacks by these white mobs. 10 white people were killed, including 2 police officers. 5 Black people were killed. Ocean Sweet, who was staying in the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity house, witnessed a gang of young white men beat a Black man mercilessly. So he's already seen a lynching, and now he's seeing a Black person being brutalized in a race riot in DC. Now we got to talk about his soon-to-be wife, Gladys Mitchell. She was born in Pittsburgh in 1898. Her mother, Rochelle Mitchell, moved to Detroit in the northeastern neighborhood, just outside of the predominantly African-American neighborhood known as Black Bottom. To maintain her home, she had to work more than one job and take on boarders. Gladys Mitchell attended Northeastern High School. Rochelle Mitchell did not live in Black Bottom, which is the predominantly African-American community. She joined the Black upper class church, which is St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. So this is in the African-American community, they would have been middle class. So the Mitchells would have been a middle class Black family. This is the 2 St. Matthew's church, the first 2 St. Matthew's churches. The one on the left was the original church. That's now a parking lot today. But the original church was founded in 1841. It was a underground railroad site. So African Americans who were escaping from slavery, that church was one of the stations to help them escape from slavery. The church that's behind it is St. Peter and Paul Catholic Church. It still is there. So that church still sits in the city of Detroit. So this church in the back still is there. The church in the front, that is now a parking lot. They would move to a neighborhood known in Detroit as Paradise Valley, which was the Black business district. And so they would be there for a while, but of course they were forced to move when the freeway was being built and destroyed that community as well. And so this church, St. Matthew, still exists, but it's in a totally different part of the city today. And in 1912, the Detroit branch of the NAACP was formed. Its first meetings were held in St. Matthew's Church. The major support of the NAACP in Detroit was from the Black churches. In 1914, Henry Ford began to offer $5 a day for all workers. And of course, that was a very high wage. So the Great Migration to Detroit becomes a central part of the growth of the Black community. Black people are coming from the South to work in the auto factories, particularly Henry Ford's factory, which is offering $5 a day even to African Americans. 5 churches will play a major role in bringing Blacks from the South into Detroit and assisting them with finding those jobs. Second Baptist Church, which is the oldest Black church in the state of Michigan, which was also a site for the Underground Railroad. From the 1920s to the 1950s, they basically partnered with Ford Motor Company to help recruit African Americans from the South. St. Matthew's also did the same thing from the 1920s to the 1950s. Bethel AME, the third Black church in the city of Detroit, it worked with Ford for about a decade, from the 1920s to the 1930s. Ebenezer AME took its place after Bethel broke its relationship with Henry Ford. Ebenezer stepped up and took their place, and from the 1930s to the 1950s. And then a new church stepped on the scene during World War II to help recruit African Americans from the South, and that's Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church. Another organization that was a major force in assisting Black people from the South to settle in Detroit was the Detroit Urban League. It was founded in 1916. The Detroit Urban League depended on these Black churches' support to do their work too. Henry Ford is considered a hero in Detroit for many things. In 1914, like I said, he offered $5 a day to all workers, regardless of race. He was far ahead of most of the other major companies in hiring and promoting African Americans at Ford Motor Company. He partnered with 5 Black Detroit institutions, we already know who they are, in order to recruit them for jobs with a living wage. He was one of the largest white supporters of the Detroit Urban League, the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and the NAACP. He developed cities where African Americans could live, like Inkster, Ecorse, and Romulus, and he also helped develop Highland Park, Westland, and Dearborn, which were white, predominantly white cities. It can be argued, if not for Henry Ford, Detroit would not have developed one of those significant Black communities in the 20th century. But he had some racial policies as well. He held many racist views, and of course his anti-Semitic views are the most well-known. But he also originally discriminated against African Americans. So the auto factories didn't originally open their doors to African American workers, and Ford was no different. He didn't open his doors either. He originally used Black employees as strike breakers. At first, his offer of $5 a day had conditions for Black workers. Black workers were placed on probation for the first 90 days, and they could not receive $5 a day for their first 90 days of work. They could only receive $3 a day. And if they stayed on the job for 90 days, then he released the other $3 to them. That's because Henry Ford really believed in some of the stereotypes about African Americans, that they were lazy, they weren't hard workers. And so he believed that they might not be good workers and might have to be fired or might not show up. So he didn't want to pay them $5 a day. What he found out was these African Americans were working as on plantations in the South, and they were very hard workers. And so he got rid of his conditions about $5 a day. But he segregated his plants. African Americans did not work alongside white workers in the plants. He preferably hired white Southerners to be the foremen over Black workers. He pushed for segregation in the private lives of his employees. And he not only supported housing segregation, he subsidized it. And so this is some pictures from the former neighborhood of Black Bottom. So this is the Lower East Side neighborhood where that became predominantly Black by the 1930s, largely because so many African Americans were coming to the city of Detroit, and they could not live all over the city of Detroit because of housing segregation. And so this neighborhood was known as Black Bottom. Of course, also what was segregated were hospitals. African Americans could not be patients at the main hospitals in Detroit, which were Henry Ford Hospital, Hutzel Hospital, and Harper Hospital. They could not be patients there, and African American doctors could not also perform medicine there either. They couldn't practice medicine there. So African Americans started their own hospitals. There were almost 20 Black hospitals in the city of Detroit. Dunbar is probably the most well-known. It was the second Black hospital. It was founded in 1918, and Dr. Sweet will be working here as a doctor when he comes to the city of Detroit. So this was Dunbar Hospital. The house that housed Dunbar Hospital, the picture you see in the middle, which is actually the picture on the other pictures as well, although you can't see the house as well because of all the people that are in the picture, but it still sits in the city of Detroit, and it's owned by the Detroit Medical Society, which is an organization of African American doctors in the city of Detroit. So this is a copy of a section of a deed that has a racial restrictive covenant. And so this is one of those racial restrictive covenants. If you read it, you'll see that it discriminated against 2 groups of people, African Americans or Black people, and Jewish people. So in many racial restrictive covenants in Detroit, 2 groups of people would be on the restricted list, Black people and Jewish people. When Jewish people were not discriminated against on a racial restrictive covenant, they would be able to move into areas. And what that ended up doing, that opened up doors for African Americans. If Jewish people were able to move into an area, they were least likely to practice racial discrimination on the group of people that followed them. And so in most cases, the group that followed them would be African Americans. And so they rent, sell, and lease to African Americans. One of the reasons why African Americans were able to move throughout the city of Detroit was as Jewish people moved, African Americans followed. So now we're going to get into some of the cases. Parmalee versus Morris in 1922. In 1922, a black couple, Charles and Anna Morris, bought property in Pontiac, Michigan. The property had a racial restrictive covenant. A.B. Parmalee, a white resident, he leads a lawsuit to remove the Morrises from the property. The Michigan Supreme Court rules against Morris, that's the black family, and rules that the black couple cannot live there, but they can own the property. So it says, so their racial restrictive covenant wasn't explicit that they couldn't buy the land, but it was explicit that they couldn't live there. So the Michigan Supreme Court said, you can own it, but you can't live there. The attorney for the African Americans is Walter Stowers. But now with this Michigan Supreme Court ruling, racial restrictive covenants are the law of the land in Michigan. During the same time period, the Ku Klux Klan is very powerful and influential in the Midwest, particularly in Michigan and Indiana. And so on the left, you see a parade of the Ku Klux Klan beginning at the Michigan State Fair in Detroit. They're going to march down Woodward and burn a cross in front of the City Hall and the Wayne County government building. So this is 1923 when they did this. In 1924, they'll do the same thing in Adrian, Michigan. In 1925, they'll do the same thing in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And each time they did it on the 4th of July. So these parades were always done on the 4th of July. In Indiana, they would have massive rallies, thousands of people, thousands of Klan members and supporters would show up at these massive rallies, almost like a state fair, and these rallies. And they also did theirs on the July 4th. But the ones in Indiana would last for 4 or 5 days, but one of those days would be the 4th of July. On the right is Charles Bowles, who the Ku Klux Klan ran as a mayoral candidate in 1925, and then he runs again in 1930. He's a write-in candidate in 1925, and even though he does receive the most votes because the Klan voters couldn't spell his name, so 15,000 votes are thrown out, and so he doesn't win that election. But he does win in 1930, and he becomes the Ku Klux Klan mayor of the city of Detroit in 1930. So there's the parade on the right. There's the parade in Grand Rapids. So you can see it's a massive parade. It's not a small group of people. The Ku Klux Klan was not a fringe organization in the 1920s in the Midwest. It would be as normal as the Knights of Columbus or the Freemasons or the Shriners. It would not be considered a fringe organization. I'm going to move through some of these. So we're going to get to 1925 to housing. And so on the left, that's Dr. Alexander Turner. He is also a medical doctor in the city of Detroit. He works at Dunbar Hospital alongside Dr. Ocean Sweet, who you see in the inset on the right. That's him in his home on the right. But on the left is Dr. Turner. They're co-workers at Dunbar Hospital. Dr. Turner will buy a house on the west side of the city of Detroit in a predominantly white community on Spokane Street. He buys the home that has a racially restrictive covenant on it by paying more for the home. So the homeowner who says, I can't sell to you, you're a black person, I don't sell homes to Negroes because there's a racial restrictive covenant on the deed that said, I can't sell to you. Where Dr. Turner says, well, I'll offer you more money. How much more money do I need for you to sell me this house? And he pays the extra amount. The homeowner, who's more capitalist than racist, sells the home to Dr. Turner. Dr. Turner moves in, and shortly, a couple of days after he moves in, a white homeowners association group shows up at the door. And I like to call them the unwelcoming committee. So this unwelcoming committee shows up, they kick in his door, and at gunpoint, they force Dr. Turner to sign the deed over to the White Homeowners Association. They throw his things out of his window and force him to leave. So he works with Dr. Sweet. So Dr. Sweet is well aware of what happened to Dr. Turner when Dr. Sweet does basically the same thing when he buys the home at 2905 Garland Street on the far east side of the city of Detroit. He buys the home, he pays more than what the house is worth because it's a racial restrictive covenant on the deed. He pays, in today's dollars, $260,000 for this home. And of course, he's a black doctor, he's very successful, and so he's paying extra money to overcome the the racism that's contained in the deed. But a mob is going to show up outside of his house as well, and they're going to begin busting out the windows, and that middle dormer window upstairs that you see in the front will open up. Dr. Sweet, his brothers, Henry Sweet, and Dr. Otis Sweet, his younger brother is also a doctor, his wife Gladys, his friends, two of his friends, his chauffeur, and his repairman are all there, and they're all armed. And as those bricks start busting through the window, that middle window opens up and 2 shots come out of that window. 2 people in that mob are shot, one of whom dies. The police, who are also in the mob, go into the house and arrest everybody. And they're charged with first-degree murder. The Wayne County prosecutor charges them with first-degree murder. He said the whole thing was premeditated. They moved into the house to do this. They planned this all along. They moved into the house to kill white people. That's really what the prosecutor was arguing. But there's some other cases that had happened earlier that year. In March of 1925, Aldine Mathis and his wife Fleda Mathis moved into the upstairs of a 2-family flat just outside of Black Bottom. They were immediately threatened by the Ku Klux Klan. And in April, mobs of white residents started to gather outside of their home. Aldine and his friend Burton had to stand on the porch with their rifles to get the crowd to move away. On April 13th, bricks were thrown through the window. Fleda Mathis grabbed the pistol from the bedside table and fired 2 shots. She was arrested. Her attorneys were W. Hayes McKinney and Cecil Rowlett. The judge ruled that she fired in defense of her home and that her act was legal. So this is March. In June, I just told you about the story of Dr. Alexander Turner. Dr. Turner's attorney was also Cecil Rowlett. And so that's Dr. Turner. He is a University of Michigan Medical College graduate, and that's his medical graduate picture on the left. Medical school graduate picture on the left. In July of 1925, Vollington Bristol, one of Dr. Sweet's closest friends, moved into a home that he had previously been renting out to whites. So Vollington Bristol is Black, but he's renting the house out to white renters. After the white renters refused to pay him over and over, he began renting it out to Black renters. White residents chased out his Black renters. On the 4th of July, Vollington Bristol came to the house with 4 Black families. The white residents met him at the house and told him not to rent to any Negroes again. Vollington told them he agreed, and then he moved into the house himself. A mob came to attack the house on July 7th, and they attacked the police officers who were stationed at the house. Black people came to the house with guns to help Bristol, and the Black people were arrested for bringing those guns to the house. Bristol stayed in the house with almost round-the-clock police protection, but he was too cautious to go outside when the crowds were around. The KKK burned a cross in an empty lot near Bristol's home. So this is Dr. Sweet's best friend. And so now we get to September of 1925 when the Sweets move in. And his first attorneys, there's Cecil Rowlett again, there's W. Hayes McKinney again, but also Julian Perry, Charles Mahoney, and Harold Bledsoe. And that's Harold Bledsoe on the right. He was a young Harold Bledsoe when he was the attorney for the Sweets. That's him when he became a judge 30 years later. The NAACP will get involved. First, Pastor Robert Bradby of Second Baptist Church. He's the president of the Detroit branch of the NAACP. He gets involved. He contacts James Weldon Johnson, who's the general secretary of the national NAACP. And then James Weldon Johnson sends Walter White, the NAACP field secretary. He sends him to Detroit to investigate this case. These are the notes from Walter White's investigation of the case. And I don't expect you to read it all, but he talks about the Dr. Turner case in these notes, but he also, Walter White basically says he believes that the case is going to be open and shut and that Dr. Sweet is going to win this case and it's not going to be much of a problem. The NAACP hires a second string of attorneys. Arthur Garfield Hayes, you ought to know he's one of the founders of the ACLU. And then you see in the middle picture, on the left of that middle picture is Henry Sweet. That's Dr. Ocean Sweet's brother. He's the defendant. And then there's some of the attorneys, Julian Perry, Thomas Chalk, and there's Clarence Darrow, who will be the lead attorney in this case, defending the Sweets. And of course, Clarence Darrow is the most famous defense attorney in the country at that time. Another lawyer on the team is this African-American lawyer, Walter Nelson, and Edward Morris, two other African-American attorneys who will be on the team. The judge of the case is Judge Frank Murphy. You ought to know that Judge Frank Murphy is a a progressive Democrat. He's a progressive Democrat, and so that's going to be a factor in helping the Sweets, that they have a progressive Democrat, because the Democratic Party overall is still supporting segregation. But there's a progressive wing that will, of course, reach its height when Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected president of the United States. This is before Roosevelt is elected president. So he's like a Roosevelt in the city of Detroit. He's going to go on to become the mayor of the city of Detroit, and then he's going to become the governor of Michigan, and he's going to become a Supreme Court justice. But he's the judge in this case. There's the Wayne County prosecutor, and there's the all-white jury that's going to hear the case. The first trial is a hung jury. The second trial is an acquittal. Even though they were acquitted and they were found not guilty, the defense that Clarence Darrow uses is that self-defense. Your home is your castle. You have the right to defend your home. So he does not overthrow housing segregation by fighting this case, but he does defend the Sweets by saying they had the right to defend their home. But while in the Wayne County Jail, Mrs. Sweet got tuberculosis and pneumonia. She brings it home to her 2-year-old daughter, who dies with TB and pneumonia. Gladys Mitchell then dies after that. Henry Sweet dies after that. And the KKK will lobby the state of Michigan to pass a firearms law. That's how Michigan got its first firearms registration law. The US Supreme Court will rule that next year that race restrictive covenants are legal. So now race restrictive covenants are the law of the national land. And the state of Michigan again passed a firearms law that they were lobbied to do by the Ku Klux Klan to stop anybody else from doing what Sweet did. And Sweet, of course, will be attacked on every level by insurance companies, by the IRS. And in 1960, we'll lose Sweet to suicide, Dr. Sweet. And so this is the IRS going after him, the article about the IRS going after him. These are 3 books you can read about the case: One Man's Castle, Arc of Justice, and Black Detroit by Herb Boyd. All right, so I'm going to move quickly through the other ones because we're really short on time. Another thing you need to know about housing discrimination all over the country, but Detroit, is the 1934 National Housing Act, when the federal government was funding the building of homes and backing the mortgages on homes. So this allowed a lot of working class people to get a home loan. So people who worked at Ford Motor Company during the Great Depression were able to get a home loan when banks didn't want to give home loans during the Great Depression. But because the FHA, which was founded by the Roosevelt administration, began to back these home loans, people got low interest rate home loans. Of course, these low interest rate home loans were only allowed for white home buyers. African Americans were blocked from taking advantage of these FHA-backed loans in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And so whites who were working class were able to get a home loans. African Americans were not able to get these home loans. They remained renters, or they moved into housing projects. And so this is the first housing project, one of the first housing projects in the country, the Brewster projects in the city of Detroit. That's Eleanor Roosevelt on the right, in the middle on the right, at the opening ceremony for the Brewster housing projects. So it was also founded by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, but it is not home ownership, it is renting. And so to keep the federal government funding the building of homes in one area, but not allow them to be in another area, maps were drawn. And areas where Black people live were in red, so they were redlined. You could not get home loans if you were building in a Black area. or if you were moving to a Black area. So the only way that whites could take advantage of these FHA-backed mortgages is if they moved away from Black people, or they moved to an area that Black people weren't living. If they moved to an area that Black people were living, the federal government tried to stop the home loans. Here you see a wall that was built to separate the white housing development from where Black people were already living. And so if the whites wanted to take advantage of the FHA home loans, but they couldn't if their homes were in the same neighborhood. So this 6-foot wall was built. A portion of that wall still exists, and you can visit it in the city of Detroit today. These are African Americans on the African American side of the wall. This is the Detroit map that tells us where home loans can be given. So green, blue, and yellow areas can receive home loans. Green, of course, will be the most likely to get a home loan. Blue is after that. Yellow is after that. Red are restricted from getting home loans. And of course, all the Black neighborhoods were in red. The GI Bill, which did some of the same kind of benefits for home ownership, did not apply for African American veterans. African American veterans could use their GI Bill benefits to go to school, but they could not use them to buy homes. And so I'm going to move to the end. The other cases are the Sojourner Truth homes, which were built for African Americans. So these are a housing project. The federal government builds them for African Americans who work in the defense industry. So if you're Black, you live in Detroit, and you work at a factory producing defense products, you can move into this home. But whites did not want African Americans living there, even though these are African Americans working for the federal government in the defense industry. This is what the sign that the whites put up. And they, of course, they have the flags, because the racists always presented themselves as if they were the patriots, even though the African Americans are working in the defense industry for the federal government. This is a group of whites who are going to block African Americans from moving into those homes. So on the day of move-in, this is the wall of whites that were there to prevent Black people from moving in. The federal government will have to send the army here to allow Black people to move in. And this is the McGee case. Orso and Minnie McGee buy a home with a racial restrictive covenant as well. If you take a look at Orso, you can see he can pass for white. And that's how he was able to get that home. But once they find out he and his family are African American, they sue to the white residents next door, sue to move him out of the home. That's the historical marker that sits in front of that home. This will go to the Supreme Court and will be known as Shelley versus Kramer, which will make racial restrictive covenants unenforceable by the government. So I'm going to move. These are 3 books you can use to find out more information about these policies by the federal government. The federal government was the #1 discriminator when it comes to housing. Although individual owners discriminated, although real estate agents discriminated, although banks discriminated, the federal government was the #1 discriminator when it came to housing. And these are 3 books that will help you learn about that. The Way We Never Were, American Families in the Nostalgia Trap, talking about the 1950s and some of the policies that existed at that time. When Affirmative Action Was White, The Untold Story of Racial Inequality in 20th Century America by Ira Katz Nelson. And then The Color of Law, which recently came out about 3 years ago, A Forgotten History of how our government segregated America. So I'm going to move to the end now because I see Jeff is here. There's a Fair Housing Act that was passed 1 week after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and it outlawed all of these practices, but it is the most unenforced of all of the federal civil rights acts of the 1960s. So housing is much more segregated today than it was in 1968. When Romney tried to strictly enforce it, he was shut down by the president, Richard Nixon. So Romney was former governor of Michigan, George Romney, but he became the Secretary of the Housing and Urban Development. Richard Nixon stopped him from enforcing the Fair Housing Act. And when Barack Obama came up with a program similar to try to get rid of housing segregation, of course, the new head of HUD, Ben Carson, after Trump won, he picked Ben Carson. Ben Carson ended Barack Obama's program called Stronger Together. And so right now we're living with the legacy of housing segregation. And these last slides I want you to see, this is how it plays out today. Black families pay significantly higher property taxes than white families. This is from last month. This article is from last month in the Washington Post. This is from last month in Business Insider. Black homes in Minneapolis are worth around $33,000 less than white ones. Here's how one expert says racism devalues Black neighborhoods across the country. And this is from a year and a half ago, modern day redlining happening in Detroit and Lansing. And there you can see again, that redlining map from the 1930s in the city of Detroit. And so we still live with the legacy of housing segregation to this day. And water shutoffs in the city of Detroit is a major case, and water shutoffs are part of property taxes in the city of Detroit. So people lose their homes over water bills. And the red section of this map are homes that are eligible to be taken for property taxes, including water shutoffs. And now, questions?
Well, thanks, Jamon. That was great. But to start us off, Jamon, we got a question pretty early on from Kirby, who was wondering, is steering a common real estate practice in Detroit and or throughout the country?
So it was. It was outlawed by the 1968 Fair Housing Act, although there were major cases still being prosecuted in the Clinton administration in the 1990s in the Detroit area. So Grosse Pointe, Century 21 in Grosse Pointe was still practicing steering. So real estate agents were refusing to show African Americans homes in Grosse Pointe and showing white people homes only in all white or predominantly white neighborhoods. And the Justice Department during the Clinton administration was prosecuting a number of real estate agents and agencies in the Metro Detroit area in the 1990s. Although it was outlawed in the 1960s. In 1968, it was outlawed.
Right. And I have a question, a few questions I'll kind of put together here. Who was drawing up the red line maps? And if you lived within a redlined area, if you were Black folks who lived there, could you get any kind of other loan to buy a home within that area?
Yeah, so who drew the maps? Two agencies were created by the National Housing Act of 1934. The Federal Housing Administration, which we know as the FHA, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation created these maps. So these maps were created by them. It was meant to standardize mortgages. Therefore, it wouldn't be some banks who would charge you a 3% interest rate and another bank would charge you 8% interest rate. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was supposed to standardize the mortgages so that depending on where the home was, if it's in the green area, just about every mortgage in that green area would get the same rate. If it's in the blue area, just about every home in that blue area would get the same rate. If it's in the yellow area, just about everybody who gets a home in that yellow area will get the same rate. If it's in the red area, they won't get a loan. So you could not get a bank, let me say this, you could not get an FHA-backed loan if you live in the red area. Banks were refusing to give loans to anybody in the 1930s and 40s if it wasn't backed by the FHA. So African Americans were unable to get FHA-backed loans in most cases. There are some exceptions. About 9% of African Americans who applied for FHA-backed loan got a loan prior to the Fair Housing Act. So there was a small group of African Americans who were able to get loans. And of course, they were wealthy African Americans. So wealthy African Americans were able to do things that working class African Americans couldn't. So if you put down half of the value of the home, yeah, a bank would say, you know, we'll go ahead and back that loan for you, even though the FHA won't insure the loan. We'll back it because you're wealthy. You know, you have the money and means. But most African Americans, most people in America do not get wealthy from being a great inventor or being a great lawyer or doctor or singer or actor. Most people move up in wealth in America by owning property. That is the #1 way to build wealth in America. And African Americans are being blocked from one major portion of doing that, mainly by the federal government.
I got a question here from Marianne, who is wondering, what is the status of evictions in Detroit?
Yeah, so right now, because of the pandemic, evictions are basically halted. So I guess that's a semi-positive condition of this COVID-19 pandemic, the governor has put an end to all evictions unless under certain extenuating circumstances, the person is endangering the home, destroying the home, or something like that. Other than that, evictions have been stopped and foreclosures have been stopped. But that is planned to end at the end of this month. So we're expecting by the end of this month a rush of evictions and foreclosures unless some other form, something else steps in to prevent what we're hoping doesn't happen.
What do you think could be done to help make fair housing, make it equitable?
Yeah, so the ideas that were done by Romney. So what Romney did when he was the head of HUD, he threatened communities that were preventing African Americans from owning homes, and banks were preventing them from blocking them from getting home loans. He said that if you do that, then there will be no federal money coming into that community for roads, for pipes, for infrastructure, any of those things. Unless you remove those racist barriers in housing, you won't get any federal monies. And of course, those communities pressured Nixon to do something about Romney, and Nixon shut Romney down from practicing his plan, and eventually ran him out of this the housing and urban development. So he was run out of HUD, and that ended the enforcement of the 1968 Housing Act until Bush won. Bush won will sign into law a very strict enforcement and punishment for housing segregation. And Clinton will begin using that against real estate agents and banks who are still practicing housing discrimination in the 1990s. So we have history of both the Republican Party, politicians from the Republican Party and politicians from the Democratic Party really fighting against housing discrimination on both sides. You've seen it. But now there's no real movement to do something about this housing discrimination and the legacy that came from it.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of questions come in right now about people who want to know what's happening today. So, within the African American population in Detroit, what percentage own their homes, and how many people are still living in these projects, or are these projects that were set up after like the Capehart Act are still in use today?
Yeah, so we still have the Brewsters. The whole, not all of them are there. They destroyed the high rises, but the low rises are still there. We got a few other housing projects, and of course, housing projects are, in some cases, there are progressives who are trying to move people out of housing projects because of the unequal conditions that exist in housing projects. And then of course, conservatives are trying to move people out of housing projects because a lot of conservatives don't believe in subsidized, federal subsidized homes. So of course, when Ben Carson came into office, he heightened the rate 3 times to live in a housing project. So whatever you were paying since Ben Carson has been in head of HUD, you pay 3 times that now. So a lot of people say, I can rent a home, it may not be a good one, but I can rent a house for less than it is to live in a housing project. So housing projects are really being moved out. And of course, because gentrification is coming into certain neighborhoods and businesses want to develop in those neighborhoods, housing projects are being destroyed. So Detroit is struggling with fair housing, and there's 2 things. There's fair housing and there is affordable housing. So Detroit is struggling for both. The Detroit region is suffering from the lack of fair housing, and the city of Detroit itself, just the city of Detroit itself, is suffering from affordable housing because certain areas are being developed, and now the people who've been living there for years can no longer afford to live there. The people who own there can't afford the property taxes that have gone up exponentially.
Mm-hmm. you've got like a shuffling of communities, and unfortunately,
people who would have been probably considered lower middle class or upper working class, and they were paying rent in the downtown area, they can no longer afford to pay rent there. So they're now living in areas where you had poor people living. So in their minds, they thought, they were doing pretty good. I'm a teacher, or I work at the post office, so I can live in this neighborhood. But no, now they live in the neighborhood where, the people who would have been considered the underclass had been living. And it's moving that way. And unless something is done, it'll continue moving in that direction.
Well, Jamon, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your presentation here. Everyone, again, I want to thank Jamon for his excellent discussion here. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. We'll see you all next time. Thank you, Jamon.
Thank you.